Welcome to The Eternal Quest. I'm Paul Meyer, and these are the tools of divination. Crystal ball gazing, the tarot, casting of the runes, consultation of the I-Ching, augury, oracle, prophecy. Now, despite the hazards of a shallow application of these techniques, there's growing evidence to suggest that perhaps they provide ways of accessing spiritual and psychological dimensions. Indeed, the great psychologist Carl Jung saw in the tarot and the I-Ching and astrology ways of accessing our unconscious mind. Our guest today is Professor Stefan Hoeller, a great admirer of Jung. He's an associate professor of comparative religion at the College of Oriental Studies in California, and his interviewer today is Bill Metzger. Here's to your future.
For our first question, I wanted to ask you just a bit generally about divination. Most people, when they hear the term divination or they hear about oracles, think of weak-minded, naive people who will believe whatever you want to tell them. You have a somewhat different perspective, don't you?
Yes, I think I do. What you are referring to, I think, is far more easily described under the term of fortune-telling, which is sort of the degenerate form of divination. Divination is a very ancient practice, which was very much part of the mainstream religion of the pre-Christian peoples in all over the world, but particularly in Europe. And it comes from the word divinity, or God. And it was conceived as the way in which the ancients in the pre-Christian era sought advice and guidance from the divinities. Now, we may not believe in gods and goddesses, although some people do today, but the effort of seeking insight into our situation and gaining some element of guidance, I think, is still legitimate, and there are divinatory modalities that seemingly are able to afford that, and they are not to be confused with lowly fortune-telling, sort of the old gypsy variety.
Yes. Well, what are some of the major systems or disciplines of divinatory practice?
We have now a number of divinatory practices which are available to us in our culture in an other than mundane fortune-telling manner. And they have particularly become popular, I think, since the 1960s or thereabouts. And among these are the tarot cards, astrology, which of course has enjoyed a great deal of popularity for a long time, and also the ancient Chinese oracle, the I-Ching, or I-Ching as it is pronounced in Chinese. And probably those three are the best known, but there are a number of other divinatory forms also.
When one is using these forms, whether it's tarot cards or the I-Ching, what is it generally that one is trying to do?
Of course, most people, as far as their consciously held attitude is concerned, are trying to find out what the future holds for them. And that in itself is not a very accurate or realistic expectation, because most divinatory modalities deal with that only to a minor extent. What they are able to reveal, I think, more frequently are not so much predictive elements of the future, but rather the trends and possibilities that exist in the present, and they are perhaps able to prepare the individual in terms of what attitudes need to be cultivated in order to take the best advantage of these trends and possibilities.
So the predictive aspect, in the form that we typically see it in newspaper horoscopes and so forth, really is a pretty shallow way of looking at it, isn't it?
Yes, I think that is shallow and superstitious. Mm-hmm. But of course, an insightful diviner will usually be able to lead the client to a deeper view, a deeper appreciation of the divination and get away from some of that strictly predictive aspect, although no doubt there are superficial diviners even as there are superficial clients.
Yes.
And all that.
As you're talking about getting to deeper levels and really talking in terms of using it as a way of understanding something about your life in the present, it sounded to me like a very psychological kind of an enterprise.
Oh, indeed. What we are dealing with, of course, are primarily psychological matters, and the symbolic ways in which the human psyche is dealt with and stimulated in certain directions.
And then related to that, there's the idea of myth, that it has a kind of a mythological character, something that we seem to have been gaining a great deal more knowledge and interest in because of the work of Joseph Campbell, for example.
Oh, certainly. I had the privilege of knowing the late Joseph Campbell, and I admire him greatly. Of course, as Joseph Campbell pointed out, we live in a culture where the main ancient mythological structures have been largely lost and garbled, and some of the divinatory modalities and practices are definitely ways whereby we are endeavoring to recover some of our myths, because they deal with symbols and they have their own mythic structure within which they function. For instance, the ancient Chinese Book of Changes, the I-Ching, having been entered into the canon by Confucius himself, we have there a very elaborate and very beautiful, subtle, psychologically oriented myth which has to do with one's attitude toward life and the various modalities and possibilities of change that occur in the world, the relationship of the yin and yang, and many similar elements, so that one really needs to have somewhat of an appreciation of the Chinese Taoist myth of life in order to truly profit from the I-Ching. The tarot, on the other hand, is involved in a Western, primarily medieval Christian mythology, coming from that era, although perhaps with some overtones of antiquity. Astrology has its own myth that is very timeless and cosmic, having to do with the heavens. So there is a definite world, a little world of thought and feeling that surrounds all of these, and they are not isolated phenomena.
A person can really sort out a lot of the issues in their lives using these in really a symbolic way then.
Oh, definitely. If they are practiced in that fashion, if the proper attitude exists whereby they are approached, I think they can be quite helpful.
Now, are there some hazards involved, some things that we need to be concerned about in these practices?
The hazards, once again, primarily lie in the person who may consult these, and it would be primarily along the lines of becoming too reductionistic, too gullible or obsessive about some element of the divinatory procedure, and then maybe bring about self-fulfilling prophecies. Mm-hmm. If you perceive a certain condition as existing as a possibility and then make that come to pass because of your anxiety. So it's neurotic people don't make very good diviners or very good divination clients either.
Right. One of the terms that you use, and one that has been getting some negative press of late as a result of some television programs, is the word occultism. Would you tell us how you understand that term?
Yes, the word occult and occultism, of course, again has quite a long history, and it is by no means all disreputable. It would seem, however, that in more recent years, some people have used the term occult as an umbrella word as an umbrella term for all manner of shady and disreputable and sinister preoccupations. The occult rhymes with cult.
Right.
In English, and so it has become a good buzzword whereby to imply sinister and unsavory things. But I think on the whole that is a rather unwarranted attitude.
It really just refers to hidden knowledge, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It comes from the Latin word for hidden or concealed. And from a psychological point of view, one might say that the occult is something that addresses itself to the unconscious mind, which is hidden from our daylight conscious awareness. And so the various situations, the various activities and studies that exist within the occult all have a direct or at least close relationship to that unconscious mind. That is really the occult. And there are great psychologists who have pointed that out.
Now you've mentioned in the book, The Royal Road, that if one is selfish in occult pursuits, that the limitations of their personality would compel them to withdraw before they could discover anything potentially damaging to themselves or others. That of course sounds very different from the sort of thing that we hear where people supposedly involved in Satanism are getting into all kinds of problems. What is really going on in these situations?
In terms of the psychological aspect again, I think what we are dealing with is power or energy. And this power is the power of the mind, the power of the soul, psychic energy. It seems on the basis of experience that the deeper regions of that power are really tapped only when a certain reverence and a certain unselfish and transcendental motivation exists within the person. Otherwise, the preoccupations with the occult, as with anything else, become simply personalistic and shallow. Mm-hmm. And that shallowness does not produce much power or energy in any direction.
Yeah, there's also a very strong ego involvement, apparently.
Yes, and ego involvement again limits the depth. This is true in all pursuits of life. If we want to get into the heart of the matter, we have to sort of lay at least temporarily some of our ego apart, and then we're really getting somewhere. And that's true of an occultist as much as it is of a person studying an academic field or anything of that sort. Now, as to all of this Satanism, since you mentioned the word, I truly feel that there is a tremendous amount of exaggeration going on, largely on the part of people who have very little acquaintance with what is going on in the occult field, and that the reports are very exaggerated and distorted. And of course, it's the most sensational sort of thing that one can say, and those who have a vested interest in sensationalism will go into that.
Yes. Mm-hmm. When you talk about these subjects, it sounds very much like the same kinds of values pertain as values that motivate all of the great world religions, the selflessness as opposed to
oh yes,
the selfishness.
Oh yes, the so-called occult is really a form of spirituality, but it is, at least in our culture, an alternative spirituality, an alternative to the mainstream religious approach, and many people within the mainstream religious field look with suspicion upon that alternative, in part because it represents a competition to their own interests.
And it's unfamiliar, of course.
It's unfamiliar, so, and a very ready field for an anxious and negative projections.
But then the purpose, really, of occultism or esotericism is really involved with a quest for wisdom, for a power that seeks to help rather than to harm.
Yes, and the quest for more meaning, for more life of the total psychophysiological organism, just a sort of thing that Joseph Campbell refers to as following one's own bliss. But now there are some people who follow their bliss in one way and others in another.
Now, when one is using practices like the I-Ching or the tarot or astrology, then the goal is then similar to the mystical practices, say, of Buddhism or Hinduism, something like self-actualization or divine illumination. Is that
I would
reasonable
say
to
that the ultimate objective behind these practices is very much of that nature.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In the Royal Road, you relate the tarot to the Cabala, don't you?
Yes.
Yes. Could you perhaps talk about the relationship between these two as examples of divination?
Yes, the Cabala, of course, is an ancient esoteric discipline that arose out of the Jewish religion, sort of beginning maybe around 800-900, 1000 AD, and at one time was a very important discipline of medieval Jewry. And at a certain point in history, we don't quite know when, but it might be as late as in the 19th century, some scholars came to combine the tarot cards with the Cabala and with the design of the Tree of Life in the Cabala, so that the tarot images became a kind of an amplification of the Kabbalistic word image. Mm-hmm. And the Orthodox Jewish Kabbalists don't usually regard that with a great deal of favor, but it's quite popular, and all one can say that it works. It's a useful combination.
Now, you've mentioned the tarot cards and the images. We have a couple of them here. I'm wondering if you can speak about this particular image and perhaps give us some perspective on how the whole system might work.
Yes, here for instance we have the ninth major arcanum of the tarot called the Hermit, which is a very beautiful image and which symbolizes in many ways the lonely but ultimately rewarding quest of the individual who seeks for wisdom, for the deeper and more valuable things of life, indicating that that kind of a journey to a certain extent is always a lonely one, as Plotinus called it, the flight of the alone to the alone. There are the summits where this figure stands, the summits of the spirit, are such that one cannot take anyone along. One carries one's own light, the light of consciousness, and leans on the staff of one's strength and goes on the way to find greater and more meaningful things in life. And so by sort of contemplating this card, one can evoke from within one's own nature the qualities of that lonely quest and see that this is really an archetypal image and situation within which one participates in life.
So it gives one a way of visualizing, really.
Absolutely, that's a very correct term.
A pattern for living one's life.
That's a very correct term, and we need really visualization quite a bit because the intellect can only supply us with words and concepts which in themselves are not all that satisfactory. Even television is a way of supplying us with imagery. Not always of the appropriate kind, but it's imagery nevertheless.
Yes. Now we have a very different
oh, yes.
kind of image here.
Now, of course, here is one whom the people who suspect Satan everywhere would be quite happy about. But the card of the devil in the tarot primarily indicates the forces of restriction and opposition to one's spiritual quest. So you might say this is the kind of image that the hermit whom we saw before might run into, and you see that demonic figure seated there holding up its hand, almost like a a traffic policeman would say, stop, you cannot go any further. These are the forces and the circumstances that try to arrest our progress. But interestingly enough, as awesome and frightening as this image looks, it's associated in Kabbalistic tarot study with the quality of laughter and mirth, because one has to be able to laugh at the devil to be able to get by him. He's a big bluff. And when
Yes.
one does not take him, one takes him seriously enough, but not too seriously, then one can defeat these oppositional elements that arise in the course of one's development.
So rather than being perhaps predictive of terrible things in your life, it becomes a kind of a reminder of some of the challenges.
Yes, it
that you face in
definitely
life.
represents the challenges which are to overcome, and it reminds us that in life there is light and darkness quite freely mingled together, and we can ignore either of these polarities only at our own peril.
Right. So we're not talking then about an evil force that is personal and that is outside of ourselves.
No, definitely not. We would be talking about certain counterproductive forces of opposition and the retardation of our spiritual progress, which exist in our own psychology. In Jungian psychology, it would be called a shadow, and not an external Satan. That is really primarily a Christian concept. In order to be a Satanist, you really have to be a Christian first.
Well, we will hide him
Hide him,
behind
yes.
the hermit. Now, of course, in astrology, a different kind of a system is used. It's a circular chart that shows the
Yes.
various signs and the houses of the planets of our solar system based on the time and place of our birth.
Yes.
But whatever the tools that one uses, the purposes remain the same.
Oh yes, I have sometimes described these various modalities as being akin to languages. One can express the same concept or the same story depending on one's knowledge in several languages. And the expression will always vary a little. But so astrology uses the language of the heavens, of the planets and the signs of the zodiac and their relationship to planet Earth, whereon we live at various times, and that is its language. The tarot has certain images which represent its language. The I-Ching has the trigrams and hexagrams which indicate the relationship of the yin and yang polarities in various combinations. These are languages, but they really all have to do with gaining guidance regarding the various issues of our lives and in the increase of meaning in our mind and in our lives.
Now, we're living in a very scientific time, and of course, most scientists scoff at something like astrology. How would you respond to a person who raises the kind of criticisms that scientists typically raise about these systems?
Yes. Well, I would feel that even a divinatory modality such as astrology, while it ostensibly, in terms of its symbols, attaches itself to the province of the science of astronomy, is not primarily tied to a physical model. We are dealing with a psychological model, a model of the mind, wherein the planets and zodiacal constellations act as symbols.
It would still be reasonable then for a person to be both a scientist and somebody who uses tarot cards or the
Yes,
I-Ching. Or
and there have been such people, and there are. The great psychologist C.G. Jung, for instance, was quite interested in some of these divinatory modalities and has written on astrology and on alchemy, which is another field, quite extensively, and had the horoscopes of all of his patients because he felt that in terms of a psychological evaluation it was of assistance to him.
so we've talked now about the use of these methods as a kind of a way of helping us get in touch with our own lives as we're living it, deal with things psychologically. But I think you've also written or talked about the idea of using them in meditation. How does one do that?
The meditation, of course, is an umbrella term, again, a very general term, really means essentially a sort of deep thought, a deeper activity of consciousness than one we are ordinarily practicing. And whenever we are confronted with a system that contains many valid and time-tested symbols, such as we find in the tarot and we find in astrology, and certainly the Chinese-oriented symbolism of the I-Ching, then contemplating these symbols within a certain context can cause a deepening of one's processes of consciousness, and can be productive of the bringing forth of content from within oneself, which is of an enriching and enlivening nature in one's life.
I'm wondering if finally you would perhaps give us a little bit of closing advice if one were new to the whole divinatory topic. How would one begin to explore that?
I would think that one ought to study the field a little bit. One should look, for instance, into the psychological theories of divination, which largely originated with Carl Jung, called synchronicity. There are several fine and readily available books on the market about that. And also familiarize oneself somewhat with the larger mythological tradition out of which these divinatory modalities have come. If one reads about the context within which the tarot exists, or the I-Ching, or the philosophy and psychology of alchemy, well, alchemy also, but let's say of astrology in this case, then go into the practice of it, then one will be much more affinitized to the real spirit of the thing, and thereby derive a much deeper and more lasting benefit from the practice, instead of just running to a tarot reader or an astrologer.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Stefan. This has been very enlightening.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed this conversation.
I'm very happy
much.
we could have this conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.